Good morning. It's 8 o'clock here on the West Coast and 11 o'clock on the East Coast. And I want to welcome you to a SmartOrg webinar, De-Risking Enterprise Next Growth, presented by Shawn Williams, the VP of R&D of Rogers Corporation, and David Matheson, President and CEO of SmartOrg. I'm Stuart Creek, and I'll be in the background. I want to give you a bit of background about SmartOrg. Our portfolio evaluation platform builds your capability to align innovation and finance to overcome conflict and drive breakthrough growth and get everybody on your team paddling in the same direction toward the same goal. The agenda for today's webinar, brief introduction by David Matheson, a presentation by Shawn Williams, and that's pre-recorded in parts, but Shawn is here live to answer your Q&A. There will be a break in the middle of the video presentation, so you can queue up your questions all during the presentation, and we'll take some of them in the break in the middle and some at the question and answer period at the end. So please turn on your computer speakers during the video presentation. If you are here by telephone, the webinar software doesn't play back through your phone during the video presentation, so you'll want to listen through the computer speakers. All during the presentation, please do enter your questions into the webinar question box on your control panel and participate in the polls. We have 2 of them for you today. So I'm going to turn it over to David Matheson, who will introduce the topic and introduce Shawn.
Hello, thank you, Stuart.
Go ahead, David.
Try again. Hello, thank you, Stuart, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here for this webinar. I'm David Matheson, and I've been doing portfolio management for a very, very long time in many different organizations and in many different places. And one of the things I find perpetually a problem is that while many organizations have portfolio management processes in place to varying degrees, they're somewhere along their portfolio journey, portfolio management often under-delivers. People want a lot out of it. They believe it's going to help them get aligned with strategy. They believe it's going to help them figure out where and how much to invest. They believe it's going to help them drive growth, and to varying degrees it does or it doesn't. But in many of the organizations I get to, it's kind of under-delivering. A little bit like the proverbial, like this shown here on this picture, of the duck who's got it going, but somehow losing what's important along the way. So some of this is that portfolio management is often co-opted by project management functions and becomes much more tactical. It loses its strategic focus. Other times things just aren't working right. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple challenges. It's a way of warming everybody up and getting everyone welcome into this session so that to prepare for Shawn. One common challenge that portfolios underdeliver in is growth. Many companies, while they would like to be growing dramatically, suffer from lackluster growth, really from ineffective investment in innovation. There's a lot of portfolios that just don't contain enough of the kinds of projects that are going to drive the business forward. Often there are many projects that are fairly easily justified, or many projects that have been kind of dumbed down to get through the vagaries of the annual operating plan and a long-range plan and to meet immediate customer needs. Sometimes projects get pretty small. So one of the challenges in driving growth when portfolio management is working well, it's actually looking into the projects and helping you find the hidden sources of upside and pointing you and helping you invest in the things that are going to really deliver breakthrough growth. So that's the first kind of challenge many companies face, and the portfolio management process kind of under-delivers on. The second challenge is clutter. Pretty much every portfolio I've come across is cluttered. I'd say often maybe 30% of projects in many companies' portfolios simply don't need to be done. They all typically have, all these small projects typically have good reasons and to be there and champions behind them, but they have the effect of diluting management attention. As people jump from project to project, every project gets sort of a slice of management attention, and there's just a huge amount of effort going into stuff that doesn't matter. There's a kind of insidious effect of small projects. People think they're often inconsequential, so they don't matter. You sort of squeeze them in, and while there's some truth to that, the overhead of just having too much stuff going on is really quite massive. So portfolio management processes often don't really resolve the conflict and let you say no to these projects. So it's just cluttered. It's portfolio management, sort of a feel-good process. Get something in there for everybody, and then all the multiple agendas are quite cluttered up, and there are just too many projects. So good portfolio management can sharpen focus by taking resources out of these trivial projects and getting them focused on projects that really matter. But in order to do that, there are typically vested interests in the organization and many different agendas, and probably the sort of biggest, most common one is the kind of conflict between finance and innovation. Finance is rightfully cautious, and they typically want to fund the surer bets, and they want to evaluate projects that have really good data and evidence behind them, and that's all good as far as it goes. But innovation is more visionary. In fact, you could think of innovation as a kind of fiction. It's actually not true. It's something we hope will be true, but it's not. And so you end up with a kind of fundamental conflict, and many companies just sort of let innovation run. They try to make a little space for innovation and just let it go do its thing, but that becomes problematic when the innovation investments start to get pretty serious. And so the question of conflict is really critical. How do you say no to ideas to fund better ones? How do you find the better ones? And so a key role of portfolio management is conflict resolution, and in particular lining the organization, or specifically innovation and finance, on the question of where and how much to invest. So these are three pretty significant goals or challenges in portfolio management, places I've seen many companies under-delivering. And in the first section for audience interaction, I'd like to get a poll going here. So the poll is, what are your current business challenges? So these are the three that I've just talked about: driving breakthrough growth, focusing on innovative projects and killing the small ones, that's the clutter issue, and managing conflict on where and how much to invest. So go ahead and pick two. And I see a lot of folks are voting here. Keep the poll going for another moment there. We're getting some more votes are coming in. And we'll give it another 15 seconds. So please go ahead and put your vote in. I'm going to close the poll in another 10 seconds. Looks like things are pretty much stabilizing on the poll. And all right, last chance. Closing the poll. And let's share the results there. And I believe you can see there that about 2/3, driving breakthrough growth is about 2/3 of the audience has this issue. So that's a pretty common one, quite prevalent. 50% of you have focusing on innovative projects and killing the other ones as a major challenge, and a third of you on managing conflict. And nobody picked other. So I guess these three do show up in quite a few places, and that's the profile of this audience. So that's great, and I think a wonderful setup for Shawn. Let me introduce him here. I've known Shawn for quite a while. He's going to introduce himself a little bit, but he's Vice President of R&D at Rogers Corporation. He and I have three things in common. We had a car ride together a while ago. We discussed board games, science fiction, and how to improve portfolios to drive breakthrough growth. They're all quite interesting topics, but probably this audience is most interested in how Shawn overcame these obstacles, these kinds of challenges at Rogers, and was able to really change the game. So with that, let me turn it over.
So the talk that I'm going to present today is called De-risking Enterprise, Next Step Growth via Emergent Opportunity Assessment. But it's really the story about how Rogers Corporation reinvigorated its product development process and portfolio by looking at next stage opportunities and filling that pipeline. So to talk a little bit about myself, my name's Shawn Williams. My background is in chemistry from a long time ago. I started life as a chemist and have spent the last 20 years in technology management, product development, innovation leadership, mostly in specialty chemical companies. I put a lot of focus on personnel development and in process development, and have worked in a number of industries, anything from microwave communications and power electronics to semiconductor processing, printed electronics, and construction materials. So currently, I'm speaking in this role as the VP of R&D at Rogers Corporation. I'll talk a little bit more about Rogers and their history. I've previously been at companies like Green Tweed, W.R. Grace, and a startup called Plextronics. Rogers is one of the oldest companies on the New York Stock Exchange. It's been around for over 180 years, and maybe a small to medium-sized company, about $640 million in sales in 2015, with about 3,000 employees scattered around the world. Headquarters is currently in Rogers, Connecticut. We operate in 6 companies and have, as of this date, more like 24, 25 manufacturing facilities around the world. Rogers as a company has 3 business segments, and they consist of the Advanced Connectivity Solutions, which is circuit board substrates for any sort of microwave or telecom application. Elastomeric Material Solutions, which would be polyurethane and silicone foams that are aimed at impact dissipation, impact protection, and can be found in anything from handheld electronics to athletic equipment to vehicles and many other industrial applications as well. The third part of our business is a Power Electronic Solutions business, and that's really 2 pieces. Laminated bus bars that go into high-speed rail and wind and solar power generation, basically any place you need to manage a high voltage or a high current. And then we have ceramic cord substrates that are used in power modules, again, for high-speed switching motors. The gist of it is that Rogers is really a materials company, an engineered materials company selling largely into the electronics industry, and prided ourselves traditionally as being a technical leader in those spaces and functioning at a high level of performance with a lot of knowledge of the application. But it tends to be niche businesses. So that's the background. When you think of the history of Rogers, we were actually started back in the 1830s as a paper company in Massachusetts. When paper started being used as a resistive material in electronics, we moved into the era of phenolic electronics. From there, we got into bus bars. When the space program was launched, we started developing our RF circuit materials for communications, and we're really well positioned when the trend in mobile electronic devices hit the world a few years ago. So really the question then becomes, where do we go from there? And I'm going to talk about that today. To give you an idea of Rogers as a mature company, we want to show to you kind of the before and after when it came to our innovation program. Now, obviously, this is somewhat redacted, but I think it gives you a flavor of the sorts of things we're doing. So if we talk about our investment before and after, you're going to hear about a 40% increase in R&D spend as a percentage of revenues. You're going to look at the portfolio and say there hasn't been a dramatic number change in the amount of key projects, but certainly it's been an upward trend. And then in terms of the potential revenue for mature products, and this is really a key metric that we focus on in portfolio management. And what this reflects is that if every product in your product development portfolio was successful, came to the market, followed its maturity arc, and generated revenue according to that plan, you'd have some portfolio of revenue annually. And so when we track that metric, we'd see the increase was about 260% from where we started before this change in our innovation strategy. Now, I will caveat there, too, with what you're going to hear. That's not going to show you the entire portfolio, but I think what you're going to see is representative. And in any case, we're going to be talking more about the process and the impact on culture and less on the actual products. Starting question is, what happens when you have a product line or several successful mature product lines and you're in business today and you start thinking about growth? And then when I talk about growth, I'm mostly talking about organic growth. Obviously, a company like Rogers, there's an inorganic growth strategy as well. But basically the mandate that I'm given and the journey that I'm exploring is mostly focused on organic growth. So when you start from the point that you've got successful, mature product lines and you want to grow, the challenge is that in addition to that growth aspiration, you have a business to maintain. You're realizing that new share is hard to find, and you're making incremental improvements as the focus of your R&D, and that's really to offset commoditization. So in summary, your focus for product development is about maintenance and continuity. So then the question is why are we in that situation? Well, I think it's fair to say that we know what we know. We understand the technology, we understand the markets and the products that we play in, we understand our role in that space, we have a channel to market, we've got customers, and there's a certain amount of comfort in doing things. And, the challenge that comes from that is that when you're in a company that's living in that world, change tends to be overlooked. You're not really geared toward thinking about change. You're not really conditioned to thinking about change. And you may even see change as a threat. So you start to ask the question, what if we can't do with what we have or we know today? And where would we go from there? If you find yourself in that situation, there's some risks that you have to face. I mean, limited continued growth, stagnation, maybe your aspirations diminish over time, and you could potentially lose share or status in the marketplace. And certainly, I think we'd summarize it as saying your strategic perspective tends to atrophy when you focus on tactical execution instead of where to go next. So I'm going to start and talk on a couple different levels here, but the gist is when we thought about reinvigorating and reinventing our culture, we were creating a strategic dialogue. And so I think some of the things that we were trying to do was to change expectations in the company, change our approach to product development and to portfolio assessment and execution, change the methods by which we brought new things into the pipeline, and to be successful, of course, we had to change the culture. In terms of expectations, we started by benchmarking where we were. And what we found was that when we looked at our product portfolio, we were expecting, in general, $11 million of new revenue contribution from a successful new product. And for a company that, at this time, a $500-600 million company, you'd say that a $10 or $11 million increase in revenue, while it would be welcome, would hardly be impactful in any major way in terms of the success of the company. I mean, it's basically not really moving the needle. And so the first thing we did when we started thinking about creating a new innovation culture within Rogers is we said that if we're going to go out and we're going to develop new products and we're going to stretch further afield than our incremental focus on our current business, we want those new opportunities to be at least $50 million. Because for a company at the time, $500-600 million, you're definitely going to see an impact of $50 to $60 million on your top line. And we recognized to move in those spaces, you had to play in new markets, you had to explore and embrace new technologies, you had to gain some new perspective on how to come to the market. And we recognize this is going to put us outside of our comfort zone, it's going to put us outside of our experience. And so to be successful from a cultural point of view, we needed to create some bridges. And so that shifted us into thinking about our portfolio as a generational strategy. And so here what you can see is this circle shows our current product portfolio. And that's the starting point. Now keep in mind, as I said before, these are successful products. They're well respected in the marketplace. Our market share tends to be high in the niche places where we play. And we have research groups in place for each of the businesses to keep and maintain and focus on making certain that those product lines do not atrophy and become commoditized. And so there you are. That's R&D for a company that's thinking basically one less than or maybe up to one breakthrough of evolution in product development. So we talk about incremental product development. We're thinking 18 to 24 months in the future, and we have our divisional or business unit R&D focused on that sort of effort. And that's nothing new to Rogers, and that's probably nothing new to many companies. And I think people are comfortable with that. But where we needed to go to was, first of all, thinking more evolutionarily about these things. We needed to get into new technical competencies, and we needed to stretch a bit further. And so these become the 24 to 36 months into the future with a new product. And instead of focusing on this at the divisional level, we were going to have corporate R&D dig into these products. And then even beyond that becomes the Gen 3 technology. And this is truly revolutionary in terms of maybe it's a new space for Rogers, but more likely than not, it's a technology that wasn't even thought of at the time that our current products were put into the marketplace. So we're thinking now 3 to 5 years into the future. We're thinking about using corporate and external resources to invent or develop this technology. And we're thinking to dramatically change the way we go to the marketplace. Now, when we think of those things, there's words we use to describe those things. And it's a continuum. So we're thinking at the Gen 1 level of consistency and sustenance. By the time you get out to Gen 3, you're thinking about radical changes to how you go to market and how you can basically be subversive about the products you're bringing into the world. So we found that basically talking about how this change was going to occur was valuable by laying it out as a generational strategy, because then the people in the business unit can at least see the key market linkages between what we're doing today and where we're going in the future as you're thinking about new products and new opportunities. The approach that we took was to create the Rogers Innovation Center. 4 years ago, when Rogers was contemplating this, there really was no longer a corporate R&D. Rogers, like many companies of its era, at one point had a fairly large effort under in-house to do corporate R&D in addition to the product line support and product development. The challenge had been that over time, those sorts of corporate R&D enterprises were expensive. They tended to atrophy as investment sort of fell off. More and more of the resources either were not replaced when they left the company, or they were pushed more and more to support of the product lines. And so we basically were in a position that when we started thinking about this initiative, we no longer had a corporate R&D. Rather than just repopulate that corporate R&D center, we decided to maintain the divisional R&D in their respective locations close to the business units. But then we created a new approach to corporate R&D, and it was really what we called the Rogers Innovation Center. And the Rogers Innovation Center was intended to be extramural, so basically off campus and off Rogers properties, away from Rogers, either the business units or the headquarters. We wanted to be agile in our approach, so swoop in, do an analysis on an opportunity, make a decision fairly quickly about whether or not it was a place to play. We wanted to be independent in our thinking, independent of any one business unit, representing all the corporation, agnostic about technology. You know, when you have an organization that has developed the capability to pursue a particular technology in the marketplace, their solution to solving problems in that marketplace tended to favor the technologies we already had. We didn't think we could afford that. We wanted to basically try to match the best technology to a particular opportunity that we could find, even if it had to be developed to do so. And I think one of the most important things that made us successful, or so far has made us successful in driving this innovation center, is that we're unaccountable for the current revenue, the current business within Rogers. So our mission is focused purely on the future, and we're not getting pulled into the firefighting or maintaining that business that the company is using as leverage and as a fulcrum so that we can make this investment. So we built the Rogers Innovation Center in coordination with Northeastern University. Northeastern is in Boston. They also have a campus just outside of Boston, Mass, in a town called Burlington. And so we sit in a Northeastern facility at that campus where we can be on a daily basis interacting with students and faculty from Northeastern, as well as working potentially with other companies that share the space with us. And at the moment, we have about 18 people that are based there at the Rogers Innovation Center, and we have a fair amount of labs and capability in that site. Now, the Rogers Innovation Center was successful to the point that 2 years after it was founded, we created a Rogers Asia Innovation Center, the AIC, in Suzhou, China. Similar sort of model. The AIC reports up through the Innovation Center in Rogers, so there's a coordinated strategy in terms of what projects to select. Like the Innovation Center in Burlington, the strategy is to develop technology primarily through collaboration with universities and other companies. The difference is where the Rogers Innovation Center is physically based at Northeastern University's campus. The Asia Innovation Center is based in one of Rogers' facilities in Suzhou, China. And when we talk about the mission of the Innovation Center, we describe it as emergent opportunity assessment, both from a technical and a financial point of view. So we go and we explore opportunities, whether that comes to us first as a market opportunity or an unmet need, or it comes to us as a new technology that might be applicable to the sorts of things that we're interested in doing in the marketplace, or maybe some combination of the above. But the idea is that we take the resources we have, we develop projects, we develop models through collaboration and sponsored research. We work very closely with the Rogers New Business Development team, and we try to very quickly get to a decision of whether there's an opportunity to exploit a new technology or develop a need to serve a new market and push that into our product development process. So we tend to use early and intuitive assessments, fairly qualitative at the outset. We try to build a portfolio of projects where we define gaps in the industry and then go look for ways to fill the gaps. We try to leverage competencies that we have either within Rogers, within a business unit, between the business units as more general competencies within the company, or beyond any given business unit. And we try to leverage dialogue as a strategic tool in building discussion around what opportunities are and what they could represent in the future. Now, to give you some assessment, and this gets back to that aspirational goal, you know, one of the conclusions we came to is that if you spend too much time at an early stage in your opportunity assessment trying to quantitatively and accurately predict the model, you're going to find that no matter what assumptions you make, you're probably going to be wrong. But if you go and you target a big opportunity, you're probably going to be okay if that big opportunity is real, if you can find a way to address it. But what we tend to find is there's always what we call the hourglass effect. So if you go out and you explore an opportunity, and maybe it's a mega trend, or maybe it's something that's hot in the trade journals right now, something that's going to change the future, you get some sort of total available market size. And hopefully that's a large number, because when you start to explore the opportunity, you find a couple things happen. First of all, you start to understand segmentation in the market, you start to understand competition, you start to understand perceived value, and you realize that market size bubble that you initially defined is more likely than not smaller than what you initially thought it would be. But on the same token, the technology that you thought you would use to address that big market, you know, maybe the challenge is that there's cost and there's compatibility and there's capability that just aren't quite what you thought it was at the earliest stages of your assessment. So eventually you get from some initial assessment of opportunity to some real available opportunity, and that's really what you're chasing when you're doing product development. But the point is, if you start big enough, if you're aspirationally aggressive enough, even after this hourglass effect, you find yourself at a point where you've got something that's worth doing. Now, in terms of tools, we use a tool we call the Real Worth Win. Some years ago, there were some Harvard Business Review articles around this sort of method. And what we try to do is we try to assess the opportunity in just a few quick, low, medium, high sorts of responses to a set of questions. And to give you an example of how that looks, I pull up a few of these questions. This is one of the real questions around need. And so the question is there a compelling need, want, or problem to solve? And low would basically be no. There really isn't anything that any customer is asking for, whereas high would be that the customer can't succeed without the solution. They're responsive to the need, and they're out there actively seeking a way to solve this problem. So we have this sort of low, medium, high response to each of these questions. Now, it doesn't mean that when you have a project that you're figuring that it has to be all green or it's not attractive. In many cases, this at-a-glance profile that shows you basically for a given opportunity what's red, green, and yellow about real worth and win gives you an indication of where in the marketplace this opportunity fits very well, where you are probably in trouble and need to focus in order to answer most critically the questions that would be raised before you can decide if this is an opportunity worth exploring. And then in some cases, you just have to drill down and figure out later in the game, these are the areas where I have to get more information. But this is the sort of intuitive, simple assessment that is about as far as we go in terms of assessing an opportunity as we move forward at the early stages. And based on this, we would make a decision whether or not to move forward. We might allocate some resources for sponsored research. We might dedicate some internal resources to doing the work, or we might be paying some third party as sponsored research at a university, contract research with an engineering lab, or potentially collaboration with another company. We're doing these opportunities is we're asking the question, is there a real problem to solve? Is there real money to be made if you solve it? And is this something that Rogers could win at? And is it a fit for Rogers? And that's about as far as we take it. I mean, there's no substitute for doing a more thorough analysis and understanding the size of the opportunity. Certainly, we do some early stage NPV analysis and some potential revenue analysis looking at, what's the size of the market more quantitatively and what's the size of, how much would our share be, so that we have a sense of what kind of business we're going after. But if we get too hung up on drilling down on those numbers at an early stage, you usually end up basically generating some assumptions that are no more valid than that very high-level assessment that the RWW gives.
Great, thank you. So you kind of use it as a screening and to get oriented in a way, I think is what you're saying. Yeah.
It's also useful too to say what are the questions that we really need to drill down on. The greens you don't worry too much about after the initial assessment. It's the yellows, in some cases, or certainly the reds, where you say this is where I have to understand where I'm going to make or break this opportunity.
Okay, so here's another question from Julie. You describe a company that has this proud history to it, I guess, and it's like the air got let out of the tires because your first situation, people's aspirations were so low. So Julie wants to know, how is it that people had such low aspirations? How did that come about?
I think part of it was that when you make a lot of money doing one thing really well, you focus on how to keep doing that. So we were still making a lot of money on our current products. And I think that, basically people were happy with that. They were more concerned with keeping things going, keeping the current level of success and growing by inorganic means than on finding new aspirational ways to grow organically. And it's one of those things, I think it's a creeping sickness that over time people lose track of it. I think a lot of our initial downturn in corporate R&D came about the time frame of the 2008 bust, and things were pretty tough. And so we cut back and we kind of weathered the storm, but by the time things got better, you know, a lot of the mechanisms, a lot of the attitudes had been focused long enough on kind of, you know, maintenance and incremental improvements that became the new normal.
So it's a kind of complacency, I guess, in a way, right? Well, you the phrase the new normal, right? It just it happened over time. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, we got a few more questions, and I would like to encourage people to put in more. There are a few still in the queue, but I think they'll be better answered at the end. So with that, let me move on to part 2.
There's another element to this as well, and so far mostly I've been talking about the tools that we use to assess project by project. And these are all opportunities that are going to be leading to stage gate. And stage gate, like many companies, we use sort of a standard Cooper stage gate to put our products through full formal product development, and that's our channel to the marketplace. StageGate has long shown its worth in terms of asking the right questions at the right stages to ensure that you're not making more than the right level of investment, or you've got a strategy for making products that are going to have an impact. But StageGate alone is not enough. And so the other thing that we were lacking within Rogers, besides having a process for feeding the StageGate, was to manage the portfolio within StageGate. And so that was where we turned to SmartOrg for help. And basically using the SmartOrg approach in their Wrangle tool to look at portfolio management as a tool for decision making, we really started to transform how we look at our product portfolio. So what I'm showing here on this slide is a typical chart that you'll see in the SmartOrg tool, and this is really simply a matter of showing probability of success on your y-axis. And in this case, we're showing NPV. We have another version where we show the potential revenue metric on the x-axis. But basically, the idea being here is the bigger opportunities that are likely to succeed end up in this quadrant, and the difficult projects that are likely to fail and won't offer that much in terms of revenue end up down here as the white elephants. So you have 4 quadrants: white elephants, which are difficult and small payoff; oysters, which are difficult but potentially offer a big payoff; the bread and butter, which are the things that are usually the things that the business unit R&D is doing as a Gen 1 R&D, Gen 1 product development, and those are the things that are likely to succeed but not a tremendously big impact on revenue; and then the pearls. And the pearls are the projects that if you're successful, they will basically be the future of your business. And the likelihood of them being successful is pretty high, because either you've already got some work done in the pipeline, you've got some knowledge or capability that you can leverage to drive those things to the marketplace. So that's how to read the chart. Now, what I've shown here is a representative sampling of some of the projects in our portfolio when we did the initial assessment with SmartOrg. And the notion here is that once you have a chart like this, you can decide where to put your bets, where to put more resources, and where to back off, or in some cases, where to eliminate projects. So after initial assessment and some calibration to make sure the projects were all being assessed on an apples-to-apples basis, we started to assess the portfolio and make decisions. So again, the metrics in here, probability of success, and that is the overall probability of success multiplied between, in this case, 4 stages of product development. So the percentage of success of passing each gate was determined pretty much by formula, and then those 4 were multiplied together, and what you're seeing, the dots here, the y-axis represents the aggregate product of that assessment. NPV is a pretty simple NPV calculation. You could pull it out of any finance textbook, and that's leveraging information about the project that you've gathered alongside your real worth win. And those are the sorts of things that we're putting in here and we're assessing as an opportunity. And one of the other features that I'll talk a little bit about later in the SmartOrg tool is it's not just put in as point data, but it's put in as a range with upside and downside, and that's beneficial for some of the later views we'll look at. So here's the Rogers portfolio, or at least part of the portfolio as it was in 2013, 2014. And I mentioned the SmartOrg piece as well. We started to do some assessment. You can see some projects that we decided to kill because they were basically too small, or maybe they didn't really fit, or they really didn't have an impact if they were successful, or maybe they weren't working very well. And then, I'm going to go in here and start to show that this is where the upside downside comes into effect, because in addition to the NPV numbers that we're showing in this chart, you can start to see the NPV numbers shown here as the white line on this bar with the upside and the downside. So this is the sensitivity analysis. And for these projects, it's not only a base case NPV, but there's some upside here. And there are conditions which, if they can be fulfilled, will make that opportunity far more valuable. And there are some conditions, if they go against you, can make that opportunity less valuable. But one of the things it really asks, and this is really the basis of decision making, is if I compare the projects across the portfolio, I start to realize some things. And for one thing, I realize that if I can get this, and this project through the stage gate as a successful product, that the value I create for the company is probably more than the value I create by getting all of these projects through the pipeline and making them successful combined. And then even more so, if I were to take resources from these projects, maybe not only can I ensure that I get these more valuable projects through the pipeline, but maybe I can start to actually target a coherent strategy to get not just the base case, but the upside through the pipeline, and I can have things that are far more valuable than simply just trying to hit the base case. So when you have a tool to assess the portfolio, you can look at the projects on an individual basis, but you can also look at them in aggregate and start making prioritization choices from one to another. So over time, the portfolio starts to look like this. So this is basically the update on the slide I showed you before. It shows the fact that the projects we killed fell away. The projects that were successful so far remained, and certainly a few new projects were put into the pipeline. And many of these new projects were the result of the Innovation Center. And so where business units tend to put more projects here in bread and butter and occasionally in here in pearls, the Innovation Center tends to be more of an oyster farm. You have projects that potentially have a very high impact on revenue and value if you're successful, but they tend to be harder because you're at an early stage and you're working at the very early stages of technical feasibility, where there's a lot that has to happen before you're in the marketplace with those technologies. But still, you're starting to see the value of the portfolio change and transform, and you're starting to make choices about retiring some of these things and putting more emphasis on some of these new opportunities. Now, again, on the drill down, I said that you could put more emphasis on to shaping that NPV, and here's an example. This is basically the outcome of some of the sensitivity analysis done on one of the projects in the portfolio. So this is one of our more attractive Innovation Center projects. You can see the base case NPV is about $300 million. But you can see the upside could be as much as $700 million. Now, the nice thing about this feature, and this is another standard chart in the SmartOrg tool, is it basically takes the elements of the NPV analysis and it shows as a sensitivity analysis or a tornado chart how and to what extent they impact that NPV value for the project. And so instead of simply developing the product with sort of an if we build it, they will come mentality, you can actually shape the product development process to focus on aspects of this thing, like in this case, average selling price, market share at maturity, penetration at maturity, and ask, what, if anything, can I do as a project manager or as a company to ensure not only do I get this product in the marketplace, but I drive towards the upside as opposed to the base case for NPV. And so you understand the path to greatness. When you're doing new product development, you're not simply developing the product, you're developing a product for success. And another impact here is it tends to shift the way people talk about products. Often when you're in a product development situation, certainly as you get to the later stages and you're shifting from the potential at an early stage to the planning that goes into putting new products in the marketplace and putting sales targets in your operating plan, you tend to see a certain conservatism because people don't want to overstretch. And so you get this sort of concern of accountability that keeps people away from promising anything about the upside. So if you can basically focus the discussion around the base case and talk about the scenarios which would enable the upside, you can shift the focus from accountability to what would it take to achieve the upside and build a very healthy dialogue around how I can be even more successful if I only had X or I only had Y. And that's a very healthy cultural change to effect. This shift from accountability to upside is asking how are we playing to win? And if you think about it, from a product development point, that means you're trying to define the proof points that are going to trigger strategic investment. So if you think about, again, what are the factors that would prove your assumptions about average selling price? If I can find a way to explore and test those factors, then I can convince myself under what circumstances I can drive average selling price, and I can go back to the leadership team and I can go back to the business unit and I can ask to invest over and above what I'm doing in the product development process already to specifically target and drive those sorts of changes. And that's really some of the value about that shift from accountability and trying to play to win. To bring it back to the Rogers journey, as I said at the early stage, when we started our program in innovation, the average project in product development was really about an $11 million incremental improvement to revenue. By the time we were at this stage, and this is probably about 2015, and keep in mind I'm still redacting a little bit, but the gist of it is representationally, the aspirational revenue per project had bumped up to $40 million per project. Now, many of the smaller projects were still there. Many of the newer projects were these ones that we saw in the portfolio that were oysters and very high potential, and that's helping to pull that average up. So the trade-off here was that we put more in the pipeline and we put more that was aspirational in the pipeline, but because we were putting earlier stage projects into the pipeline and projects with a lot more uncertainty, that average percent probability of success came down overall. So we were trading value for certainty. And that's part of the process as well. And one of the reasons why it's important to maintain this sort of analysis in a real-time basis and to consider it and to assess it on an ongoing basis. So here were some of the things that we saw as a company and the way we were managing aspirations through portfolio management. We had a growth team level goal put in front of us to grow 30% of, basically to drive organic growth to be 30% of revenue, so basically meaning that new products would be a percentage of total revenue by 2021. We were going to have this method by managing strategic investment across the Rogers portfolios. We were going to make a conscious effort to review and fund strategic programs, particularly the growth initiatives at the corporate level. And basically we were going to allocate the lion's share of our research dollars towards the oysters and pearls. And so we created what we call the Venture Committee and the Venture Program, which is a growth team-led quarterly oversight to the oysters and pearls in the portfolio. Along the way, there was much that we learned. Okay, we had learned how to overcome the accountability trap. We had realized along the way by having resources that were cooperating closely with the business but had a separate charter that we had to find ways to avoid rivalry between the BU R&D and the divisional R&D and find a way to complement one another. When we develop projects, they're led by the Innovation Center. They incorporate members of the business unit R&D and from the business unit marketing teams from an early stage, so that when we are able to transition a project from the Innovation Center into the business unit. We don't have this over-the-fence sort of exercise where you toss it over the fence and hope somebody catches it. We actually have a very intimate and very progressive transition that involves a lot of dialogue and a lot of collaboration, where before and after the project is transitioned in ownership. So you need to keep that participation across the organization, and you need to have a good discussion so that all parties involved don't feel defensive about what they're doing today. They're more motivated by how to improve what they're doing than being judged on what they've done in the past and try to defend what their old strategies were. You know, we find there's a lot of interplay around real worth and win, and that's all technology, but the deployment is social. And so dialogue and cooperation and basically buy-in is a key piece of what we do. And from a metrics point of view, we realize that you can get bogged down in calculations and the modeling, particularly at an early stage. So we try to go for a simplicity versus system in our metrics. We go for less is more. We focus on directional, qualitative assessment versus quantitative. We try not to get caught in the details, and we recognize that in an early stage, often the numbers are a guess. So if you can get to a reasonable, arguable point of view, that's probably good enough, especially if your targets start off to be big to begin with. Now, when we look at Rogers, you know, basically the journey from tactical to strategic and early stage technology is an ongoing process. We try to assess kind of how we're doing, and here's some of the things that we point to as indicators, because, you know, as it is, when you look at the timeline for some of these things, much of our technology that we developed in the Innovation Center is still yet to see the marketplace. So we're still in the mode, we're developing the technology, we're moving it towards commercialization, but it hasn't had a revenue impact yet. So we tend to look at other metrics to see how we're doing. We were founded in 2013. We're now 24 people worldwide. At the time that these slides were made, we had put about 53 new patents out there to defend the new technology that we were developing, and they're in prosecution today. Now that's important because not only is it a large group of patents, but it represents a 400% increase year over year from 14 and 13 alone. And at this point, we've moved more than 4 projects out of the Innovation Center into product development in the business units. And we opened our Asia Innovation Center in Suzhou, China in 2015. We're in the process of opening an Innovation Center in Europe. First team member hit the ground in 2016, and we continue to develop from there. So the takeaway from this is that it's hard to incubate without a strategic perspective. It takes a combination of aspiration and processes and simple tools and cultural change. It has to be focused both on the project level and the portfolio level, and you have to pay attention to where you are and decide where and when you invest more to have not just get it to the market strategy, but get it to a winning position in the market strategy. And that's it. So I'll just close with showing again the investment was a 40% increase in terms of what we were spending per year in R&D. The number of projects has increased at least by a sixth, probably more than that. And on this portion of the portfolio, we've seen about a 260% increase in the value of the portfolio as measured as potential product revenue from new products. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions here. I think in the interest of time, I'll just take 1 or 2 of them, and then we'll do a very brief wrap-up and a poll, and then anyone who needs to go, of course, can, and then we'll maybe continue for a few minutes afterwards to finish whatever questions they are as long as we can. But there were a couple here I thought were kind of juicy. So, Shawn, you had showed the white elephants and the probability of success versus NPV, and you had talked about changing the white elephants. And so at that time, Jim asked, what is your experience redesigning white elephants? Does that really work, or is it better to just kill them?
Yeah, I think it depends quite a bit on the particulars of the project. In many instances, what happens for White Elephant is that it's painful at first, particularly the early stages. People want to hold on to things. When they first see the opportunity, they first start to have some success, they start to get more comfortable with killing them. But I think sometimes what's easier to do with a white elephant, you play this game where you say, well, we don't have to kill it, but let's de-emphasize it. Let's kind of put it on the back burner and spend these resources on other things. And then, you know, things go along, and the next thing you know, you just never get back to some of those projects. But, you know, definitely there are people who are precious about these things, people who feel that their usefulness to the company are tied to a particular type of technology or product line, and they might fight you on these things. I think, you know, none of this was really emphasized here, but if you don't have a mandate from kind of at a leadership team level to make these changes, it's going to be a pretty tough battle to make any differences in how you go to market or what you focus on.
Great. Thank you. There were also a number of questions on essentially the accuracy or quality of the analysis and how you were using them. So maybe to summarize the spirit of this, these questions is maybe you could comment on the importance of getting accurate numbers versus the importance of using them to drive new conversations. What is the right trade-off there? And how did that work for you?
Yeah, I think, you know, that's another good question. You know, in terms of the numbers, and we talked before, at an early stage, often it's difficult to say just how right your number is. I mean, what we do, we use a tool, and I didn't show it here, we call it the what do you need to believe. And the notion would be if you start and say, hey, there's 1 billion cell phones in the world, you know, maybe 80% of those are smartphones. Of the smartphones, you know, if I could put 4 antennas in each one that had, you know, 20 cents of content, you kind of get to some number of what the TAM is all about. You know, you're using market reports, you're using available information to kind of rough out those numbers, and you're probably wrong. But the point is that if you put that kind of assumption up in sort of an equation written on the PowerPoint slide, everybody can see what assumptions you're making to get to the size of that market. And then, you know, if you say, well, okay, suppose I'm wrong by 50%, you know, instead of a $300 million market, it's a $150 million market. You know, for the purposes of this conversation at this stage of the game, that's still a valuable market if we're successful there. And but that, again, pushes you towards the higher aspirational targets. So, you know, when we're doing the real worth win, when we're doing the initial assessment, we're at those numbers. You know, some of those numbers feed preliminarily into the NPV, which shows up in the SmartOrg charts. But it's the mandate of the teams running the projects that as you go along through product development, you're continuing to update and refine those numbers as you gather more and better information. So the idea being that by the time you're ready to launch a product, you've replaced those initial rough assumptions with meaningful assumptions. And you should see the value of your project, you know, bob up and down as you go, both in terms of potential value, either up or down, and probability of success. Certainly as you get closer to commercialization, you should see those numbers climb. So I think, you know, don't get too hung up on it at the early stages, but you have to be committed to continually refining your numbers as you go.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think that's all questions we have time for now. We will come back. Let's just sort of close up and then finish, and then we'll have a few more questions in the queue here. Just to kind of pull this together and bring it back to the audience, we started with some challenges, and people voted on driving breakthrough growth and focusing on innovative projects or killing the clutter, managing conflict. And so we picked 4 of the things you talked about you doing, balancing risk and return with that innovation screen there, understanding the upside with a tornado diagram, finding projects that matter in the comparing uncertainty, and creating that path for future growth by kind of organizing around 3 generations. There are many other things you said too, but these seemed like pretty interesting ones. So I thought we'd just do a quick audience poll on that as a way of kind of closing this. So which of Roger's approaches do you feel would advance your goals in your portfolio process? So go ahead and vote. So a number of folks are voting here. Looks like about half the folks have voted. More coming in. Give it another 15 seconds or so. Looking good. The votes are starting to stabilize here. And all right, you got another 5 or 10 seconds here. Please get your last votes in. I see a couple more have just squeaked in under the wire. All right, I'm going to close it in 3, 2, 1. All right, the poll is closed. So let's take a look at this here. You can see that probably the most important tool is understanding the upside, things like the tornado diagram. And certainly you talked a lot about that, Shawn. The second one is, wait, we may be having a sound problem here. You can hear me? Okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, the first one was understanding the upside as like the tornado chart. The second one was finding the projects that matter on that comparison basis, which would help clear the clutter. And the last one was the path for future growth, kind of organizing those multiple stages and building the organization around those different areas. So sounds like everyone got some ideas. Hopefully something you can go do for meeting your portfolio challenges. And with that, let me just say if you do want to follow up, please email Stuart Creek. He's going to try to deal with the questions, field them for us, and pass them on as appropriate. SmartOrg will be continuing to do future webinars, and you can come to our website, smartorg.com, to learn more about portfolio management. We've also put in a link to a case of a very elaborated portfolio process there for those who want to know more. So thank you all for joining. This will conclude the official part of the webinar, and we will hang around for another few minutes to take a few more questions, but thank you so much. Okay, so for those who are still on, let me read out a few more of the questions. Brian wants to know, how do you get accurate probabilities of success? So Shawn, maybe you could comment on probabilities of success.
Hello, this is Shawn. Sorry, phone line.
Hi, Shawn. Okay. Did you hear the question, Shawn? We're going to take a couple more questions.
I heard nothing after you put up the poll, David.
Okay. So we're in the extended overtime period to deal with a few lingering questions if you have time.
Yep.
And I had just teed up the first one from Brian, which was, how do you get accurate probabilities of success?
Yeah, so we don't, is the simple answer. What we tend to do is, you know, the probability of success represents basically the product of the 4 probabilities from the 4 stages that are in kind of the tool. And we have kind of a menu selection, sort of a low, medium, high default for each stage that we put in. And then the people putting in the projects will start with that and then argue it up, the number up and down for each stage based on the particulars of the projects. And then you get the product from there. And, you know, after a while, you get a pretty good sense of what's a reasonable number. You know, it's always going to be at least somewhat subjective. We're actually in the process now of talking about adding some other tools around maybe doing a complexity analysis, you know, kind of in an offline document to kind of supplement that and basically build our confidence that we're getting good numbers for probability of success. Certainly for a completed phase, we count that as 100%, and that one drops off. But that doesn't necessarily mean the overall probability gets any better, because if we think there's still some hard problems to solve, we may be reducing the probability in the later phases to adjust for that too.
Yeah. Another question is, how do you deal with the comparability of these probabilities? And a version of that is, which is more important to you, accuracy or comparability?
I think at the early stages, well, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, it's probably somewhere in between. We would rather have something that's directionally correct because there's not a whole lot of difference between 65 and 75% probability. If they're both in the same quadrant for projects, then it's really more about other factors of value in the project. But on the other hand, you know, if you're using sort of apples and oranges to assess those things, then it becomes much more difficult to say if they really belong in the same quadrant. And then there's a couple different levels to this. So what you saw in aggregate represented basically the 3 business units in the Innovation Center. And so the consistency within one of those subgroups is probably more important than consistency across the whole organization, because we generally don't tend to fund or defund projects across the business lines, mostly because the resources required for one or the other in terms of people and skill sets and geography are so different.
Great, thank you. You had mentioned that you had top-down support behind these changes. How did that work? Did you get those people on board, or did they bring you on board? And how did you get the executives behind the changes?
Yeah, so basically when the reason I was hired by Rogers was when our CTO and our CEO sat down and realized they needed to come up with a plan for kind of basically refreshing longer-term R&D. They came up with this notion of let's go outside and build something. So that started from there. Certainly as the growth team kind of came to grips with this, you know, there's still, even today, there's a lot of selling of the value, and I think nothing sells better than success. So the early stages is we're just getting things off the ground. It's a lot of good discussion, a lot of hype, but we're living on credit, and at some point, you know, what's going to really make the difference long term for the innovation approach to Rogers is to put some new products in the marketplace and show that they're successful. You know, so right now we've had enough traction, we've seen enough of our projects move forward to the point that we've got prototypes getting feedback from customers, we've got business units taking responsibility for some of these projects, hiring people to drive these programs. It's all moving in the right direction, and I think we're going to start seeing revenue from some of the first of these things in the near future, and that's really the proof that's going to drive continued support.
Yeah,
both at the board and the growth team level.
Yeah, there was another question about how were people resistant to these changes and how did you overcome them? But it seems to me you just answered that question, right? At the beginning you had some credit, and then by demonstrating success you were able to move things forward. You have this is not a question from the audience, but a question from me. You have a kind of quote that I know you use as a sort of motto. I think it's from Sun Tzu, and I think it says a lot about what you're talking about here. I wonder if you would care to share that and explain how it applies.
Yeah, so in terms of that, it's basically strategy without tactics is the slow route to victory, and tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. And yeah, go ahead.
Great. No, I think that's kind of a picture of what you've done here, right? Is you were in a very tactical situation. People were responding very tactically, and by adding this strategy layer, you're able to really move it forward. Yeah. So and I just love that quote, so I wanted to get you to say it. All right. Well, I think we're well over time. That's the questions. Thank you, everybody who's still with us. Thank you very much, Shawn, and we'll be signing off.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.